Well, I love the drumming. It's terrific. Let's have more of that. Karen's taken all my speech, actually. You've done in 5 seconds what I was going to do in a few minutes. But let's have a go here. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very flattered. Je suis flatté. I think the first question to ask is, everybody likes to talk a big game on innovation, but critical voices are too few, and I urge you to join them. Because if we really want innovation, we have to have a supportive but also critical attitude to it. So why are we in that business in the first place? If you can make out the chart, the EU is the green line here, showing the proportion of gross domestic product that is spent on research and development. You can see that China, the blue line here, has already begun to overtake the EU in R&D spending. Korea is motoring very fast, and Japan has always been high. But in general in the EU, we are not spending serious money on research and development. And it's not just me saying that, it's a lady who you didn't vote for, you probably don't know, but she is the Commissioner for Innovation in the EU, and here I do agree with her. She said that the EU faces an innovation emergency, where we're just not turning out the new products and new processes as fast as we should be doing. Now here's a fellow Dutch person. She's the Director General of the International Energy Agency, and she looks happy enough, but if you bother to follow what she says, she's right that energy R&D is down by 2/3 since the 80s. The digital world is advancing, although even there, as we'll see, not fast enough. The energy world, the transport world, and many other sectors of society, construction, agriculture, chemistry, and these things, are not moving even at the relatively modest pace of IT. The crisis is especially bad in energy because if you want to do all your digital communications, it's important to have the lights on as much as the air conditioning. Now, what's slowing up innovation in Europe? Too much state interference, too much interference by lawyers, a short-term vision based on quarterly results and cash flow in the case of small and medium enterprises. But the big factor, I would say, is the psychology of exaggerating and inflating risks. And this is something that your communications could usefully address, and it's important to do. If you think of all the things that you're supposed to be dying of, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, phthalates in iPads, the plastics that the EU has banned, the tuberculosis you may have picked up at the discotheque last night. It's a remarkable thing that most of us are growing as tall as the Dutch and as long-lasting as the Japanese. Longevity has never been higher, and yet our panics, our sensibility to risk in the medical field has also never been higher. So I think it's very important to address that issue. And I think generally the risk consciousness of the Western world has inhibited innovation so that the can-do spirit of the 60s, the kind of mentality that led John Kennedy to set the goal of getting to the moon within 10 years, we've lost that plot. We no longer believe that innovation is a good thing. We tend to think it's dangerous and needs to be very heavily regulated. And I'm bound to say that the British have followed the Germans in all of this, in being apprehensive about innovation. That's one of the main reasons we need to uphold it if we believe in it. The second reason is that scientific innovation and discovery is very often stigmatized. Now, this is the guy who used to run General Motors before he ran the Department of Defense in the United States under Eisenhower, and he famously said, "I don't need to know why the grass is green." And what he really was saying was that we don't need to know why the sky is blue. We don't need to have blue skies research. We don't need fundamental research. Who would ever be interested in why things are colored the way they are? Actually, if he'd read his history, he would know that John Tyndall, the Irishman who worked out why the sky was blue, was responsible for 5 separate practical innovations, including the tubes that they put down your bronchial throat and into your lungs and into your stomach to find out what's wrong with you. By understanding light better, and sunlight, and wavelengths, and all of these things, this useless piece of research that Tyndall did in the 19th century has become useful, very useful, in the 20th century. So I think we have to face the fact that in the West, more and more, and in universities and elsewhere, and in boardrooms, the phrase blue skies is always said with a sneer. It's regarded as just a little post-it notes session, instead of understanding that fundamental scientific research is integral to innovation, and without it, we're going to continue to lose the plot. And the third thing, which Karen's already stolen my thunder on, is that it's an American tendency, because of Silicon Valley's boosterism, to reduce innovation from energy and construction and agriculture and manufacturing and all of these other areas just into the digital world. Now, you're in the communications business. It's understandable that you like video, short form video. You're always looking at digital communications and all the rest of it. That's fine. That, ladies and gentlemen, is not the whole substance of innovation. And it's interesting that the West likes to focus on the part of innovation that seems to be going fastest, and would rather not remind itself of how slow developments are in even electric cars, in transportation, in many other sectors. And just to illustrate this, this is a hydrophobic chemical that the Indians developed to protect textiles and seating from dirt and bacteria and all the rest of it. It's got nothing to do with the digital world. If you bother to look Google the phrase self-cleaning textiles, you will find that the initiative for innovation in that area, as so many today, is coming from the East, not from the West. And it's important, because when you fly to conferences like this, if you're going economy like me, that is, you'll find that even the economy seats clean themselves because of these kinds of chemical developments. So they're kept clean, they repel water, they repel dust and grease, and they're easier to clean when they're changing over the planes. So that illustrates in a very simple way how we need to remind ourselves continually, given the hype from America, that innovation goes further than electrons. So these are three important reasons to uphold innovation, and to make the point also that innovation isn't something that starts in Silicon Valley and then it just sort of fans out over the United States and it meets a nice venture capitalist in Wall Street, and the result is that we're all happier than ever because we've got a new app on our mobile phone. That's not how it works. Innovation, ladies and gentlemen, is a fight. It's not an automatic process. There's not a little dynamo out in Silicon Valley doing all of this stuff. It depends on the morale, the direction, the goals, and the objectives of people in labs, on the factory floor, in fields and farms, and elsewhere. It's a social process and a human process, and if you're held back by risk consciousness, it's not going to go ahead. Now, what do we mean by innovation? We can learn some lessons here. How do we define it? People will tell you that innovation is a Mars bar that's 1 inch longer, or that it's a brand extension. And generally, brands have tended to dominate the discussion on innovation in the marketing world. I think the first thing we must say is that innovation, to be worthy of the name, is something fundamentally new. If you look at Einstein's paper, the one with which he revolutionized modern physics and beat Newton, 1905, here's the beginning. Does the inertia of a body depend upon its energy content? Here's the middle. Gets a bit tricky here. And here's the end. That's it. 600 words, including the formula E equals mc squared with other letters. It's like getting in a Porsche. You know, you're 0 to 60 miles an hour in about 2 seconds. So that was a fundamentally new idea, relativity theory. It was not a combination of existing ideas, as many innovation commentators will suggest to you. Innovation has to be fundamentally new. We're not in a McLuhan world where you just have to move an idea from one sector to another. You just transfer ideas, or you combine ideas. You have to come up with fundamentally new ideas. And that strict definition of innovation, which I like, too easily forgotten, especially in the marketing world. Now, speaking of marketing, does anybody know who this is? You've all quoted him. Very few of you have read him. But you're always talking about him, and none of you know what he looks like. His name is Abraham Maslow, and he's the guy with the hierarchy of needs that you're always going on about and drawing pyramids, although you haven't read his original article in the September 1943 edition of the Psychological Review. If you read that article, which is much better than anything anybody in marketing ever said about needs, I've got to tell you, way, way better, much more subtle and fluid. One of the things he notes is that we're not just needy animals. We are curious. We want to understand. We want to discover and establish relations between things, find the meanings of things. That's why we're better than fish. You know, you can have a school of fish, but fish never built a school. We're different from the animal world. I know it's very unpopular and everything. So the second thing that I want to say is it's not just fundamentally new. It has to be certainly attentive to the needs of users. As our journalism man said so eloquently, you know, listening. But also, you've got to ignore users. You know, Google never did a focus group, thank God, when it came up with Google. Akio Morita never did anything like that when he came up with the Sony Walkman. Going your own way, knowing your own mind, doing those fundamentally new ideas without regard to people, even if you listen to them, is very important in innovation. And the third thing is, if you take the Model T, 1908, any color you like as long as it's black, it was a change in product, a new product. It was a change in process, a new way of assembling cars, the assembly line. And the final thing that's often neglected is it was a change in organization, because Ford set up a whole battery of dealers who offered low interest credit to car buyers. And usually the whole three processes, product, new process, new organization, tend to go together. If you're missing any of these components, you've got to question whether it really is innovation. And that's why when you get a new mobile app on your handset tomorrow morning, ask, is it really new? Is it really changing the world? Or have I just bought the hype? So there's old Henry. Now, why do I say these things? Because to do all of those three things together and to really move society forward is, and I repeat it, it's a struggle. It's not an automatic process. Let me illustrate that struggle by one or two individuals. Hooray for the Germans. Werner Forssmann was a doctor. He's the first person to insert a catheter in a human heart, his own. His department chief told him not to do it, and the nurse he was working with, he had to tie her down to an operating table to stop her interfering. Of course, today he would be busted for that, but thankfully that didn't happen. And he inserted the catheter in his heart, and the rest is history, and many, many people have lived as a result. If you take the Dutchman, Willem Kolff, he developed the world's first kidney dialysis machine in 1945, and he gave it to a Nazi nurse after the war was ended. You do that to Nazis because as a medic, you're not supposed to discriminate. How did he make that dialysis machine? He used sausage skin and the parts from fallen Luftwaffe fighters. Luftwaffe fighters that had gone over the Netherlands, he took them to bits and he made that dialysis machine. And not content with that, he built the first artificial heart and was criticized very widely for it in 1982. Terrific risk taker. He hid a lot of Jews during the Second World War, and then he went on to do these universal innovations. Well, you take the woman who co-discovered the structure of DNA, Rosalind Franklin, struggled against a lot of discrimination and lack of recognition. And then you take somebody like Barry Marshall in the University of Western Australia. He discovered, or he suspected, that stress, or what the Americans call information fatigue syndrome, otherwise known as work, He felt that it wasn't, he thought, well, the reason we get ulcers isn't to do with stress, it's actually a bacterium. And this is it, the nasty little beast on the right, Helicobacter pylori, the helicopter that's in your gut is the Latin translation of that. And he thought, well, I'm going to drink 10 billion of them to see if I'm right. And he did that, and a week later his wife nearly divorced him because he looked like shit. And after that, he won a Nobel Prize. So I want to say that, when you're doing all your innovation, and when you're trying to raise the level of discussion internally in your corporation around innovation, this critical, if supportive attitude, the recognition that it's difficult, it's hard work, you must take risks, and real individuals are involved in a life and death struggle around it, that for me is very important. Now just to wind up, I want to say, what can you do about that? Well, there are a few things you can do. Sensing new developments, this is an $80 Amazon device that will tell you whether the meat in your breakfast is off. Sensing things is important. Displaying information and your ideas and innovation, where Chinese cities like Shanghai make buildings into cinemas like this. Displays at work, like the largest oil refinery in the world in Jamnagar, Gujarat, India. The installation is by Barco, our Belgian hosts. We'll all be working like this within the next 10 or 20 years, with any luck. Are you preparing to collect and sense and then display and organize the best kind of information about innovation inside and outside your company? Data visualization, ladies and gentlemen, will be very important in all of that, and it's too important to leave to the IT buffs, much as I love them. Rapid prototyping with 3D printing is important, and the next conference you should really have all these printers in the breakout sessions, and then what you do is, instead of the flip charts, you make little prototypes of your ideas, just like that, very cheaply, and that way people can gather around the fire. And you also need to use IT to chase up those breakout group members to see whether they've acted upon that brilliant idea 3 months down the track. So you're sensing, you're displaying, you're prototyping, you're 3D printing, and you're also delivering great books and ideas to people's homes. That's employees' homes, like Amazon is beginning to do, and they're doing on this 35-story block of flats in Dongjiang in China. Sensing, displaying, doing all of these things around innovation is more than a digital task. It's something that has to embrace every discipline and raise the level of debate. And when we're talking about raising the level of debate, this critical attitude that I talked about, you better have a look at this book. It's rubbish from start to finish, and that's why it's so influential in the digital world. A review will appear on my website shortly. These are the authors. Their basic thesis is that the robots are coming, that IT is taking all of our jobs, and it's a wonderful book. Everybody's quoting it, the Financial Times as well. They're all supportive of it. None of them, until very recently, the FT had some figures, which I have found, on the pace of development of robots. In fact, the robots are not coming nearly fast enough. If you look at the forecast for 2014, you'll see it's 200,000 robots supplied all around the world. Sounds like a lot, but even the lethargic Obama administration and the lethargic American economy is creating 200,000 jobs a month at the moment, and that's just America. So it vastly overestimates the speed of introduction of robots and indeed the speed with which IT is taking our jobs. It is taking our jobs a little bit, maybe even a little bit more than in the past. But this book, which really boosts our IT as truly intelligent, is something that is not going to do us any favors. So don't be an uncritical booster of IT. You and I know that the interruptions to service, like the air code this morning, are just as impactful as that new app on your mobile tomorrow. I just want to end by saying, young people are really idolized by our digital friends. And if I hear that phrase, digital natives, one more time, I'm going to throw up. because it was so boring. You know, do you know my son? He's so brilliant with a tablet. He knows everything about everything. No, he doesn't. He has not read a book from cover to cover. You know, I know this is... You lack discrimination, ladies and gentlemen, but thanks. And the second thing is he doesn't even know how a central processing unit works, let alone, you know, anything about Einstein or that paper that we all ought to know. So I'm saying let's be serious with the youth, and what you need to do is get them in your corporation, the young people, to introduce a rubbish book on innovation or a good one once a month to the board or your peers, and tell everybody what's in it, what's not in it, what's the context for it, what's right about it, what's wrong about it, and what we do next. If you've got a young person in your company or a group of young people to do that work, reading a book from cover to cover, and to make that presentation, that alone, ladies and gentlemen, would be an innovation. Because nobody's doing that in European industry. And it's about time somebody did that, and then we can have a critical discussion. That's all I got to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to James Woudhuysen. Come over here to the table. You've got your headset on, so we don't need the hand mic. Thank you very much for giving us some rather, and making a call for book review sessions, ladies and gentlemen. It sounds interesting. Now you're going to go home and take some going to be a few long faces when they hear they have to go out and find a good book on innovation. The only things you don't seem to forecast are the weather, the stock market, and I think you also said the horse races, no? So what actually goes on in the mind? You've shown us a lot of history here today, but we're actually talking about the future, and what do you do when you're looking into it to actually project what we're going to be seeing?
Well, forgive me for disobeying the brief, but we're in marketing, so what's new? I just want to say that understanding the past is very important to understanding the future. And the second thing is, one of the reasons that we've lost the plot on innovation in the West is that we think the future is something that happens to us, not something that we make happen. That loss of sense of agency in a globalized world where impotence is the main event in the West, and the initiative for innovation has passed to the East. So I'm perfectly happy to talk to you about the role of drones in construction, of satellites in agriculture, of what's really happening with robots, about how a product like this will be just covered with printed electronics in the future so the whole surface will be functional. And I'm delighted, even for free, to give you that consulting. But whether we get those developments depends on us. That's the force of my speech, right? Innovation is a somewhat subjective question. It's a question of morale and of consciousness and sensibility to risk. So if you follow half of what I've said, then we will have a more innovative future. If we just want to sit back and predict what's going to happen, like it's all just going to come out automatically from Silicon Valley, then we're not going to have a future.
Now, you work for some of the world's leading companies. What is your experience of how much room there is within sometimes rigid corporate structures for actual, real, innovative thinking?
Well, there's a lot of innovation still happening, right? If that wasn't happening, I wouldn't be here. I think your rapturous reception, which I put down to the hangover this morning, it's actually not that uncommon. Because if you make half the points that I'm making in a corporation, a lot of people, including the finance people and the marketing people, not just the techies, will rally round and say, hey, this is right. We are slowing up. We have lost the plot. We are too determined by the quarterly results. So I think all we have to do is a bit more emperor's new clothes, folks, which is the purpose of the talk this morning, is you get in there and say, look, I'm right behind you. I want innovation. I love IT, but it's not good enough, and we're not satisfied. And then a lot of other people will say, well, we're not satisfied either. Let's do something about it. So I think the potential is right there.
Okay. Well, questions from the floor for James Woudhuysen.
I'd prefer criticism, because I'm sure you don't agree with
questions or criticism.
With much of that.
There's a hand over here. Can we get a microphone round? I don't see our microphone people. Here, I'm going to send this. Could you just pass
it's all
that
done
back to
digitally now. Did you notice?
Back here. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Caroline. I work for DNV GL Energy. I have a quick question. You ask us to communicate more about innovation, but how do you see that we can innovate better in communications? Is it just about digital media, or do you have any idea about that?
Well, the customer is not king, in my view. That was the force of my remarks about focus groups and Google. The customer is a prince. Content is king. So the most important thing for you to do is not discuss which platform, which brand, which color scheme, which distribution database and all the rest of it. Content, content, content. Critical engagement with ideas. Out of heat can come light. And, by the way, I want to say, the next time you have a conference, don't have a Q&A session. Right? You ask the questions, I give the answers. No, we're grown-ups. We want debate. We want the clash of views. We want a content contradiction, where out of that we can clarify ideas and really force them through. So that's the most important thing. It's all very obvious, but in the West we easily forget it because we're entranced by form. We love form. We don't like content so much because content raises some difficult issues. Now I look to the Germans, it's the Hegel in me that wants a bit more of that to move us forward. Right? We can all say we love the digital, oh it's so amazing, but that euphoric kind of approach, it's not going to get Europe out of a hole.
Another question right over here. Perhaps you could just pass. Yeah, okay, there we go. We've got a microphone.
Okay, I'll take you up on that. One of the things that you said was that innovation isn't about taking things from one sector and applying them in another. But why should you dismiss that? I mean, I used to work for EasyJet Airlines. And one of the things about EasyJet is they stole heavily from other industries and other paradigms to fundamentally disrupt the industry that they were in. Why dismiss that form of innovation?
Great. Now we're talking. I love it. Hooray. I put it in an angular way because obviously I'm alive to the fact that one does steal from one sector and apply to another. And that is a part of innovation. I dismiss it to wind you up, but also because the fashionable view is, if you take Scott Berkun, if you know that book, B-E-R-K-U-N, sorry to quote a book, The Myths of Innovation, he and many other people make combination or stealing the main event. That's why I oppose it. If you take Henry Chesbrough, C-H-E-S-B-R-O-U-G-H, he's the guy who coined the phrase, I'm sure you're all using it nearly as much as Maslow, open innovation. And that's all about, hey, we're not like Apple, closed and secretive and hierarchical. We're open. I mean, who would not want to be open? Right? And what you say is, well, look, I'll buy a startup here, I'll make a venture deal with the university there. I'll steal these ideas. I'll be a fast follower like Panasonic rather than a leader. And it's all very well, but eventually if you keep stealing, who's actually originating the innovations? If everybody wants to be a Dell, who is actually going to be an Apple? Now, another speech, if you ever want it, I'll tell you more about the $150 billion that Apple has in the bank, earning no interest, and it would rather do that than put it in a laboratory. So it's in that spirit that I'm saying just stealing or buying a startup or using a model from one industry to another isn't good enough. It is important, I concede you that, but it isn't as powerful as the stuff that we really need and the stuff that we've had in the past. So it's in that spirit that I don't dismiss it, but I take a critical attitude to it. Great question.
Further questions for James Woudhuysen?
Further criticisms, hooray.
Julia Maddock, UK Science and Technology Facilities Council.
It's another quasi-autonomous non-governmental organisation with which I'm unfamiliar.
We fund Blue Skies research and applied. You talked about the romance and heroism of innovation, but you didn't really touch on any modern innovators that were role models there. And I was just wondering who you felt were the people we should be looking to and saying, we want to communicate about innovation like they do.
Well, I'm sorry, you're very youthful, young lady, but Barry Marshall, I know he's over 60, but he's still alive, so I mean, let's be quite clear that anybody kind of over 21 is out of the picture with innovation. Now, we understand that. The cult of youth. Who do I admire? Well, and who you should get people to follow? Well, let me tell you the bad guys, because in business you've got to work out who you want to destroy. If you read Eric Schmidt's new book, he's a bad guy. Not because he's evil, because he's an idiot. Right? If you read that book, it just does not stack up. We're entering this whole new world. It's all digital. Either you're with it or you're not with it. You're out of it. That's it. Right? Oh. If he could write, it would be a big help. But he can't even do that. So, these are the debates we need inside corporations about what is good and what is bad. Now, I thought what you were going to ask is, which innovations should we be backing? And part of that is also which should we not be backing? Well, let me tell you now, if anybody comes in the room like Jeremy Rifkin, if you know him, and talks about the hydrogen economy, hydrogen-powered cars, and hydrogen, they are talking hot air. Right? If you bother to look at it, in order to separate hydrogen from oxygen in water, you're going to use an enormous quantity of energy to do the electrolysis that's required. So we need to romance with the great innovators. She's coming back for more. I haven't persuaded you. She's English. But we also need to have a critical attitude to the individuals and particular innovations. Not every innovation is going to succeed. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try, but some are ruled out from square one. Go on.
I think we've cracked hydrogen. We've got a new method of transporting it as ammonia in our lab last week.
Well, let's have a beer about it. We'll have to look at it. Please.
Thank you, Julia, for those questions. Any other questions? Do I see any hands shooting up anywhere? Up in the back? Any other criticisms? Over here, Pierre Gaude, here at the front, if we could just bring a microphone up. Thank you.
And I'm ancient, so I'm not a digital native, but the digital natives argue that regulation will kill innovation. I'm a bit worried that Google is going to take over my entire life. What's your view?
Well, it's easy to be glib about regulation and to say, in a free market way, well, no regulation. I don't support that. We've got to have some rules. Right? I think at the moment in the West, and even in the supposedly neoliberal American nation, regulation is quite overbearing. Right? If you go to Britain, I don't know, try not to go there, but if you do go there, that we would like to ban high-speed 2, foie gras, naked ladies, a free press, fizzy drinks, sugary drinks, smoking, electronic smoking, nuclear power, fracking. You go on, and the ban mentality is really enormous. Now, when I go into a contract with Google or Facebook, I expect them to look at my private life. They're sad people. They're going to be looking at bullshit stuff, right? So if they want to do that, and somebody wants to come along and say, hey, it's a surveillance society, Vance Packard, who I'm sure you all know, the Hidden Persuaders and the Waste Makers, all of these amazing books that were wrong but much better than the wrong today, 1959 and all of that stuff. He wrote a book in '65 called The Naked Society, right? And it was all about surveillance. And he said much better than what our conspiracy theorists and Julian Assange and all of these idiots say today. So if you're worried about Google, I share your worry a bit, but I'm much more worried about the ban mentality, right? Because the ban mentality, if you continue it, would make a speech like this very difficult in 10 years' time, right? If Google wants to look at my private life, go right ahead. I got better things to do. If your life is being taken over by Google, I think we better have a beer about that.
All right, so there's some meetings at the bar, obviously scheduled for after these sessions. Any more questions? Otherwise, I think I'm going to thank James Woudhuysen for waking us up here this morning with this very sort of challenging approach, and probably a number of take-home messages.
I'm a pussycat, really. Don't take offense.
Lots of things to think about on the plane home. Thank you very much,
you.
James, for opening our session today.